the payments line up to what the grid is. But in our view, there should be oversight and adjudication process basically by the board. The board should have a look into what's actually transpiring there, to look at the expenses and tuition that are actually being administered and make sure that everything's okay. We did not actually get down into a full level detail of the audit, but it does tie to the next item on the list, which is the credit hour derivation. The grid for determining the tuition at the four-year colleges, the pricing for a four-year college career is priced on an assumption that you need 32 hours a year for 4 years to graduate to get up to 128 hours. The universities do block billing so that the tuition, a full year of tuition, applies not just to 32 years, but if you take 24 credit hours, the full tuition is charged. Anywhere between 12 and I think 17 credit hours a semester is charged the same flat rate. Well, we're building the pricing assuming it's 16 hours. What this can do is, if you have students that take less than the 16 hours, there's essentially an extra cost borne by the system. If they take 12 hours of credit in a semester, they're charged the full tuition. But you only collect the full tuition on an assumption of 16 hours a semester. So you do essentially have more loss exposure there for covering those credit hours in that way. Again,
what is there loss exposure for the plan? What wouldn't there be exposure for the students there?
Yeah. Well, let's give you a little bit harder example of what this is doing. Let's say we're going to price a year at $1,000, okay? And we're going to allow you to credit by credit hour, so you can deduct up to 16 credit hours for 1 year's worth of payments. You paid based on 1,000 hours. We're going to deduct one credit hour at a time. And so when we made that payment, we thought that there were 5 credit hours in a year. And so 1 credit hour was basically worth $2,000. So that we're going to pay out. We thought we're going to collect money based on $2,000 per credit hour. But when the college actually does make the change, they say, well, no, it's 2 credit hours is a year. So each credit hour costs $5,000. So when Mpact is billed by the universities, or junior colleges, they're going to bill them $5,000 per credit hour. So in that scenario, you're collecting $1,000 per credit hour, paying out $5,000 per credit hour. That's where the disconnect comes in.
Another way of explaining it is we price on 32 hours a year. 4 years gets you up to 128 hours. When it's actually administered, the number of hours are basically whittled away. You have a sort of a bank of 128. Whatever the student applies for is subtracted off. If the student enrolls 24 hours a year, it would take 5 years to get to 120. If the student does that, they have the 120 hours. Mpact will pay 5 years of tuition when the purchase was for 4 years of tuition. Not only that, but at the end of 5 years of 24, they'll have 8 credits left over and get a refund. So you have exposure there for somebody that stretches their college career out. You're paying full tuition for 5 years when you've only priced it in for 4. Now, we didn't look into the detail to see how prevalent this is. Anybody who's taking 16 hours or more, 16 hours is what we priced it on, so they should be cost neutral on that. Somebody who's taking more, you're going to get a little bit of a windfall there.
So
I don't know why we would have those assumptions.
Well, these are not.
I mean, we're obligating the system for student choices that may or may not be good ones.
Well, this is something that changed from the time. You got to keep in mind when Mpact was first put in place, the schools were charging based on a 32 hour per year credit hour, and then at some point the schools started changing. As we understand, They did not all change at the same time, so it was a school by school change. Now they all are charging on the 24 credit hour per year basis. And so this was just something that kind of got overlooked. It was a change. When the change incurred, you should have gone back to your contract holder and said, hey, look, the way we're being charged isn't what we're being paid for. We're only going to pay for this. This is what we're obligated for. Because that was the term of your contract when you entered the contract, regardless of how the schools have changed their administration. But that didn't happen because this wasn't. It wasn't out in front. It just kind of happened. People understood it happened, but nobody said, "Oh, look, this is a change that really should be changing the way we're paying out or collecting or something." And so it was just kind of moved along and accepted, and no action was taken on it. And so now we're getting to the point where we have a disconnect, and that disconnect needs to be fixed.
Yeah, we would actually agree with you that reflecting the actual practice should be what you do in the pricing. And that's actually a bigger principle to keep in mind is when we get to the decision process of fixing the system and fixing the pricing, it's not going to be a situation where, okay, we fix it and we move on and let it run and it's just going to be fine. This is an example where you have to keep tabs on it. You have to have flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances that are outside the scope of the contract. So there are many parts of a process that can be put in place in the pricing.
So the other scenario could be, let's say a student takes 16 hours a semester, and 3/4 of the way through their college career they change their major, and it takes them an extra year. So is the model liable for changing major the same way as it's liable for a student only taking 12 hours?
I think not. I think you promised 128 hours. If they use the 16 hours a semester for 3 years, they've used up that many hours. They'll only have, if I do the math right, 32 hours left. If they take 2 more years instead of 1, that last year is not going to be covered by the program.
Yeah, so for me, this is both a policy issue and a financing issue. It would seem that the contract ought to speak to 8 full-time semesters, because otherwise there's an additional benefit that many students are receiving.
And our point in bringing this up isn't that we want to change the way you're administrating, it's that we want to make sure that the pricing matches the administration. That's the key here. Everything we're going to be talking about really centers on the pricing. We want to make sure that you're collecting something that's going to equate to what you're paying out. We just want to make sure that everything syncs up in total. So how you design the program is a policy decision that policy decision should be reviewed and visited on a regular basis, and we should be allowed to change the pricing to match that policy decision as you go along.
This kind of relates back to more of that earlier or same type question that on existing policy holders. Can we mirror what the college is doing, or is there a set contract that we cannot vary from? It says set number of hours as opposed to set number of semesters.
Well, again, the contract says, of course, it's based on the time the policies and procedures are in place. And so that is certainly an issue we need to look at again to see if there's any adjustment that we could make. And this is just showing another loophole, another gap in the program that has to be addressed when we look at it the whole. But certainly that's another area that we'll ask the Attorney General's office to review as well.
Are there other questions on the pricing? I'm going to skip over the discussion of the valuation. Like I said, the valuation is pretty much more of the same, but there are some other aspects of the program. If I can have you turn to Roman numeral 1, page 4, the executive summary.
PDF page 8.
In terms of securing the system. We put some other recommendations for policy decisions that this board can make. We mentioned the fact that you've got the investment risk that's borne by the board and not by the contract holders. You've got the tuition risk, the same way, borne by the system, not by the contract holders. So, in a sense, it operates similarly to an insurance contract. You promise a benefit based on the essentially premiums that the members are paying. So, like an insurance fund, you could set up an extra claims reserve. You could build into the pricing again an excess charge to build up excess assets. Generally, when we're looking at funding a system, you want to set a target for funding 100%, but you want to, in this case, since the system bears the investment risk, Mpact has to cover that. You want to build a margin in there and say have a funding target of 115 or 120%. That extra cushion, that extra margin of assets would protect you from some of that downside risk. A way to achieve that is essentially building that into the pricing model of it would have to be new contracts going forward, essentially charging them a little bit more as insurance protection for that downside risk. Another way of doing that is the second item is it depends on how far you want to go. You could charge for all of the investment and inflation risk in the pricing of the new contracts by taking extremely conservative assumptions. The thing to keep in mind is the more conservative you make those assumptions, the more you raise the price of the new contracts and you make it cost prohibitive to new contracts in the next generation of college students. So there's a balancing act between how much you want to charge the new contracts to protect for the downside risk there. There are some other features that could be changed to limit some of the downside exposure. One of the issues that I think we mentioned briefly was you have a 10-year period that people can use their credits after matriculation. That's kind of a long college career, longer than in some other states. Now, you do want to have some flexibility because people people do have circumstances that change and they take time off or spread their college career out. But you could change the administration, you could change the contract so that you shorten that period, say give them 6 years or some other period. Ken already mentioned the fact that once you reach graduation, if you have unused credits, you could have them forfeit those as opposed to refunding those. Again, these are all things that give you downside exposure at the tail end of the college career. The first one I didn't mention was you could only provide a tuition guarantee if matriculation occurs within a fixed period after graduation from high school. That's another issue that we have. Under some of these contracts, people graduate from high school and they're still open a long time before people engage them and enter into college. That longer period before they start college, you have all the tuition risk increase in there that wasn't fit into the pricing. If you have that, if you allow for a change there, if somebody waits more than 3 years before starting college, you could basically renegotiate and reprice it and have them charge for increases in tuition above expectations. So those are some things that are really just throwing out ideas as to other things that you can change to mitigate some of the risk of the contracts.
I think one of the other ideas it's kind of buried in here, we didn't give it a lot of discussion because it would be a big plan change, but up at the top, the bottom of that top paragraph would be a complete redesign. If you wanted to say, well, we want the participants to actually share in the risks and the gains, you could create kind of a hybrid type of a situation where instead of guaranteeing 4 years of college, maybe you guarantee 3 years of college. So you have a defined benefit type of a plan for the first 3 years, and you append a defined contribution plan for the last year. And to the extent that you have losses, you can reduce that last year's account. But to the extent that you have gains, you can increase that last year's account. And so that gives you a way to actually share the risk a little bit with the current contract holders by doing something like that. So there are a lot of different avenues. Some of them basically no change to the current structure. Some of them are big changes like this to the current structure. But it's all about measuring, controlling, and pricing your downside risk. That's all we have for the audit. We have our projection tool, which I wasn't sure if you guys wanted to take a break. We're throwing a lot out at you right now. We'll let it marinate a little bit.
Anything else? What we'd like to do is break at this time, get our lunch, and then we move to the projection tool, which will give us some additional scenarios, able to put in actual numbers, we can see what the potential options are. Look at the unfunded liability. So it gives us an opportunity to see a broad, vast options. Now, we can break and keep going, or we can break and have lunch for a few minutes, and it's whatever's the wishes of the board. We have a working lunch, or we can take a couple minutes. I know Dr. Bounce has to leave early, so
Good, I'll change the thing.
you've changed, so you're good. Okay, that was my concern. We talked about that earlier. Okay, then why don't we break for lunch and we start back at